What's good, YouTube? It's your boy, Blue Blood Sports TV, back at y'all with another one. So, I told y'all last night that the longest reigning champion in the sport of boxing, WBC featherweight world champion, superstar boxer, Mr. Gary Russell Jr. was on Fred's Barbershop Conversations last night, and he had a lot to say. One in particular, he brought up a story of how he shattered and broke the jaw of undefeated 3-division world champion, former junior welterweight undisputed world champion, and currently the WBO welterweight world champion, and is widely considered the best pound-for-pound boxer in the world, Terence Bud Crawford. With that said, right, Mr. Gary Russell Jr. stated that he broke Terence Crawford's jaw after Terence Crawford disagreed with him about a sparring session that Terence Crawford had. Terence Crawford has now responded to Mr. Gary Russell Jr. by saying that Mr. Gary Russell Jr. is indeed clout chasing. He says, look at Mr. Gary Russell Jr. trying to get some attention off my name, right? He says, wait till I come back and wait till I get out of this situation. What situation is Terence Crawford looking to get out of? Maybe Terence Crawford is in quarantine. Maybe Terence Crawford is alluding to the contract situation, right? Everybody disagreed and thought that he should have never signed that contract and re-signed with Top Rank and Bob Arum, and ESPN, because it hindered him as far as his ability to make big fights with other welterweights whom are all on the other side of the street, right? So with that said, a lot of people felt like, Terence Crawford shouldn't have re-signed with Top Rank, right? But he did anyway. To each his own, that's his prerogative. He thought it was the best situation for him and his family and his future. Can't knock him for that. With that said, Terence Crawford is stating that, wait till I come back and get out of this situation, then you'll have to see me, and I'll see you, basically, is what Terence Crawford is saying, right? And the thing about this is, you have to wonder what he's alluding to. Obviously, that leaves room for speculation, right? That leaves room for people to create their own narratives, right? To say, oh, Terence Crawford said he's leaving ESPN, so on and so forth, right? That's what that leaves room for. With that said, Gary Russell Jr. is a 126-pounder. He said that if Terence Crawford wanted, to rectify the situation and he wanted his get back, he said that Terence Crawford could fight him and he'll come up to 147. He's not asking Terence Crawford to fight him at a catchweight. He's not asking Terence Crawford to come down in weight. He said, I'll go all the way up to 47, create history, and defeat Terence Crawford. He gets hit way too much. Now, like I stated in the video when I told you guys that Mr. Gary Russell Jr. had this to say on Barbershop Conversations, it's a lose-lose situation for Terence Crawford, right? Because everybody's going to state that, Terence Crawford should beat Gary Russell Jr. And if he loses, well, he never was what we thought he was. He was overrated, right? So it's a lose-lose situation. But is the competitive nature of Terence Crawford, because Terence Crawford moves at the drum of his own beat anyway. So is this gonna bother Terence Crawford? No. But at one point, he did say when it regarded to rival, undefeated, unified WBC IBF welterweight superstar boxer, Errol the True Spence Jr., he said that he wanted to beat Errol Spence Jr. at his very best because he didn't want there to be any excuses, right? He didn't want people to say, well, Errol Spence wasn't ready off the car accident. Errol Spence wasn't himself. Errol Spence, he didn't want an asterisk by it. So he said he wanted Errol Spence at his absolute best, so he wasn't willing to fight Errol Spence immediately coming off that car accident. So he wanted Errol Spence to get some tune-ups. Now, with that said, this is an entirely different situation with Gary Russell because Gary Russell broke his jaw. Now, this did take place in the amateurs when they was younger, but needless to say, Gary Russell Jr. told this story that the world didn't know about. You understand? And Gary Russell Jr. said that If Terence Crawford is a man of his word and a man, he would admit what took place. This is not a rumor. It's not speculation. This is truth. This is what Gary Russell Jr. had to say. And so Terence Crawford responded. So this is personal. So is Terence Crawford willing to take it? Right? It would sell. You understand? Manny Pacquiao jumped up multiple weight classes. Shane Mosley jumped up from 35 to 47. Right? So it's definitely possible. You understand? Shane Mosley did it. Manny Pacquiao did it. Now you have some guys like Mikey Garcia attempt to do it and come up short. But hey, listen, you win some, you lose some. Gary Russell Jr. is very, very skilled. He has a lot of talent. He has very fast hands. He has a high ring generalship, high ring IQ, right? But more times than none, a great big man beats a great little man. But is it possible for Gary Russell Jr. to be successful? Absolutely. He has all the tools. He has the boxing knowledge. He has the wherewithal. He has the skill set. He's still youthful. So absolutely he could pull it off. Anything's possible in the sport of boxing. But Terence Crawford didn't deny that this situation took place. He just stated that Gary Russell, in a sense, Terence Crawford co-signed it, right? Saying nothing says everything sometimes, right? Sometimes saying nothing speaks volumes. Silence speaks volumes, right? And he's not silent, but he didn't deny it, right? So, and Gary Russell doesn't come off as a guy that just makes up stories like this. So more than likely it's true. Now, did the situation play out the way Gary Russell remembers it to play out? Who knows? Only one knows, right? The action and the results is what counts, right? Because when you look at it, Terence Crawford might have his side of the story. At the end of the day, it resulted in this situation, in Terence Crawford's jaw being shattered, broken, or injured, and him having to go to the hospital. So let's see how this plays out. It's an interesting saga, in the very least, in my opinion. But that's all I got for y'all. Y'all already know what it is. It's your boy Blue. We want to see Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence, Sean Porter, Danny Garcia, the upper echelon in the welterweight division. No slight to Gary Russell Jr. And we would love to see Gary Russell Jr. In my opinion, I would much rather see Gary Russell Jr. versus Shakur Stevenson. Gary Russell Jr. versus Navarrete. Gary Russell Jr. versus Miguel Bichette. Gary Russell Jr. versus Leo Santa Cruz, Gervonta Tank Davis. That's who I would much rather see Gary Russell Jr. face off against, aside from those welterweights. He even called out Mikey Garcia. That's a fight I would like to see. I would much rather see Gary Russell in there with guys that don't have such a distinct size advantage over him. And I want to see Terence Crawford in there with the best that's going to absolutely challenge him. No slight to Gary Russell Jr., right? But I want to see Terence Crawford in there with the best welterweights in the world, and I want to see Gary Russell in there with the best lightweights and featherweights and super featherweights, so on and so forth. Even junior welterweight, 140 pounders. He called out Adrian Broner. Let's see how it plays out. That's just my opinion. But that's all I got for y'all. Y'all already know what it is. It's your boy Blue, Blue Blood Sports TV. Hate, like, comment, and subscribe. You haven't subscribed, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, hit the bell icon to get all the new notification. Follow me on Instagram at Blue Blood Sports TV, all one word. Y'all already know what it is. Shout out to the entire LDBC. Shout out to New Media. Shout out to Black Media Row. Make sure you like and share these videos. That's all I got for y'all. Peace.